This is a course on international relations, but let me ask you a question that might sound strange. When we say international, which nations are we really talking about? Did you know that the vast majority of countries, over 80% of countries recognized by the United Nations today, were at some point in the last 200 years under direct colonial rule of another country? So when we use the core terms of our field, sovereignty, international law, national security, we have to ask, whose definition of sovereignty are we using? Whose laws became international and whose security has historically been prioritized over others? Postcolonialism argues that you can't understand world politics today without first understanding who got to write the rules of the game. And that's exactly what we're going to investigate. Postcolonial theory emerged as a response to a simple but profound realization that the world we live in today is still shaped deeply by the legacy of colonialism. At its core, postcolonial IR asks us to re-examine the supposedly universal foundations of the field, ideas like the nation-state, sovereignty, law, and order. It asks, what if those ideas only seem universal because they were constructed by a small handful of powerful states at the height of their imperial dominance? Postcolonial scholars argue that we need to center the voices, experiences, and political realities of the colonized, not just the colonizers. It's a project of intellectual decolonization. Thinkers like Edward Said, in his foundational book Orientalism, show how the West produced an image of the East as exotic, backwards, even dangerous, in order to justify domination. By constructing the Orient as a fundamentally different and inferior place, the West could frame colonialism not as conquest, but as a moral or civilizing mission. Frantz Fanon, writing from Algeria during its war for independence from France, described colonialism not just as a political conquest, but as a violence of the mind, one that shapes identity, language, even the way people imagine freedom. He argued that the colonized person is taught to see themselves as inferior, a process where, in essence, the colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. He becomes whiter as he renounces his blackness, his jungle. In other words, for Fanon, this violence of the mind forces the colonized to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressor, leading to what is often called internalized colonialism. In IR, postcolonialism challenges the way our discipline tells the story of the international order, as if it flowed naturally from the Treaty of Westphalia or the League of Nations. Instead, it argues that the international order was built in tandem with colonial violence, and that understanding today's world requires us to trace those colonial fingerprints across our political and academic institutions. Now, let's take a look at how postcolonial theory challenges the traditional foundations of international relations as a field. Most IR theory, as we've discussed, especially realism and liberalism, rests on a particular origin story. We've covered this in another video. States emerged out of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, gradually forming a system of sovereign, equal, and autonomous actors. The world became international as those states interacted, made alliances, went to war, and built institutions. But postcolonial theorists argue that this is an incomplete and deeply Eurocentric framing of the story. While European states were negotiating treaties with one another, they were also colonizing the vast majority of the globe. Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Americas didn't enter the international system through Westphalian equality. They entered it through conquest, through dispossession, and through force. Yet most IR theories don't account for that. They treat the colonial experience as an unfortunate side note rather than as a central structuring force in global politics. And for postcolonial IR, this isn't an oversight, it's a theoretical choice that renders the experiences of most of the world's population invisible. Take sovereignty, for example. In theory, all states are equal under international law, but in practice, colonialism built a two-tiered system where some nations got to be sovereign while others were governed without their consent. Underpinning this two-tiered system is a concept that mainstream theories of IR have completely ignored: race. Postcolonialism places race at the very center of its analysis, arguing that the entire colonial project was justified by creating a global racial hierarchy. Race wasn't simply just a social prejudice, it was a political technology that determined who was civilized and rational enough to rule, and who was primitive or childlike and thus required ruling. This is a direct challenge to theories that treat states as abstract, interchangeable units. Postcolonialism asserts that you cannot understand world politics if you ignore that, for centuries, the rules of the game were based on a global color line. As the scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois famously prophesied, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Postcolonialism insists that this line continues to shape global power into the 21st century. Or consider security. For colonizing powers, security meant maintaining control over territory and resources, even at the expense of local populations. Entire imperial wars were justified as policing actions or civilizing missions. And even today, security threats are often framed in ways that echo colonial logics. Think about how migration, terrorism, or even climate refugees are discussed in Western policy circles as threats to be contained, not as symptoms of histories to be reckoned with. So, postcolonial theorists asked whose security gets prioritized, whose sovereignty gets respected, and whose knowledge is considered legitimate. Now that we've seen how postcolonialism challenges mainstream IR, let's focus in on some of the core concepts that drive this approach. These ideas offer us tools for seeing global politics through a very different lens. The first is Eurocentrism, which is essentially the idea that European and more broadly Western experiences, values, and institutions are taken as the default or universal standard for understanding the world. In international relations, this shows up everywhere. We're taught that the international system began in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, a treaty between European powers. That modernity, democracy, and capitalism, and even rationality all emerged from Europe. That peace is something developed nations figured out while others still need to learn it. But this version of history ignores or downplays the agency, complexity, and the contributions of the rest of the world. It treats the Global South as a site of conflict or development, but rarely as a source of ideas or theory. Postcolonialism pushes back. It asks, why does Europe get to be the narrator of world history? And what happens when we see the world only through European eyes? If neocolonialism describes what power continues to look like, coloniality explains how that power operates through structures of knowledge, culture, and a racialized social order. Colonialism didn't end when the last flag came down. Scholars like Aníbal Quijano argue for a coloniality of power, a framework where race, labor, and knowledge were organized into a global hierarchy that has outlived formal empire. Coloniality, in other words, is the afterlife of empire, visible in trade patterns, language hierarchies, economic dependency, even in the dominance of Western academic knowledge. Think of how development often looks like this. The global north gives aid, loans, or advice, while the global south receives, adapts, or resists. The term subaltern refers to those populations that exist outside the center of political and economic power, and whose voices are frequently unheard or misrepresented. Gayatri Spivak famously asked, can the subaltern speak? In international politics, the answer is all too often no. Her point isn't that people can't literally talk, but that dominant structures, be they political, economic, or academic, are not set up to hear them. She also warns well-meaning scholars against the arrogant assumption that they can easily give voice to the oppressed. As she notes, this act of representation can itself be a form of silencing, arguing that there's an impulse among benevolent intellectuals to speak for the subaltern. But in the act of speaking for, you are, in a sense, confirming the muteness of the subaltern. Think of it this way. When a war breaks out, when aid is distributed, or when treaties are signed, who gets to speak? Whose knowledge is treated as credible? Whose experiences are made visible? For instance, in global climate negotiations, the scientific models from Western institutions are often treated as objective knowledge, while the lived experiences and indigenous knowledge of communities directly facing rising sea levels might be dismissed as anecdotal or unscientific. For postcolonial theorists, this framing is an example of the subaltern struggling to speak in a language that the powerful will recognize as valid. And instead, they argue IR needs to listen to the margins, to see how knowledge itself can be an instrument of domination. Building on the psychological tension that Fanon identified, thinker Homi Bhabha asks, what happens when the cultures of the colonizer and the colonized inevitably mix? He goes beyond a simple story of domination to explore what happens in the in-between spaces of empire. Bhabha doesn't see colonized people as passive recipients of culture. Rather, he shows how they subvert empire, not through open revolt, but through subtle, disrupted performances of identity. He uses the concept of hybridity to describe how new, mixed forms of culture emerged in what he called the in-between or third spaces of empire. Crucially, this isn't a peaceful blending. For Bhabha, a key part of this process is mimicry. The colonizer often demands that the colonized subject adopt their language, manners, and institutions to be more like us. But when the colonized person mimics them, it's always with a subtle difference, almost the same, but not quite. This mimicry is deeply unsettling for the colonizer. It exposes the fragility of their power and creates a new hybrid identity that is neither fully one thing nor the other, challenging the very idea of pure or authentic culture. Think of how English, the language of the British colonizer, was adopted and transformed across India, Africa, and the Caribbean, eventually becoming a powerful tool for anti-colonial movements to communicate and forge new national identities. For IR, hybridity reminds us that power and resistance are complex. Culture is not just a backdrop of politics, it's a site of struggle and transformation, where neat lines between nations and identities are constantly being blurred and renegotiated. One of the most influential ideas in postcolonial thought comes from Edward Said, that of Orientalism. Orientalism is about how the West historically constructed the East, especially the Middle East and Asia, as a mysterious, irrational, exotic, and often dangerous place. According to Said, this representation was not just a collection of lazy stereotypes, but a sophisticated system of control. As he wrote, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. These representations have real-world consequences. They help justify military intervention, surveillance, and civilizational rhetoric, like the U.S. framing of the invasion of Iraq as a mission to liberate and modernize. In this view, knowledge is never neutral, it reflects power. Finally, neocolonialism refers to the ways that colonial power persists, not through direct rule, but through economic pressure, cultural dominance, and military alliances. The term was famously articulated by Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, who saw this as the final and most dangerous stage of imperialism. According to him, the essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political policy, is directed from the outside. In postcolonial IR, neocolonialism helps explain why former colonies often remain locked in unequal economic relationships, or why independence hasn't always meant true autonomy. Think about how trade rules favor Western corporations, or how international lenders impose austerity policies on economies in the global South, or how foreign military bases remain in former colonies decades after independence. So, what does postcolonial theory actually help us see in the world? Let's walk through a few real-world examples where the insights we've just uncovered help reveal dimensions of global politics that are often overlooked. In 2003, the US and its allies invaded Iraq, claiming that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and emphasizing the need to liberate the Iraqi people. But postcolonial scholars argue that something deeper was going on. Edward Said's concept of Orientalism helps explain how the Middle East is constantly framed in the West as dangerous, irrational, and in need of saving. These representations legitimate intervention not as domination, but as benevolence. Postcolonial theory reminds us that representation is power. When entire regions are imagined as problems that need to be fixed, that shapes policy and often justifies violence. Climate change is a global crisis, but it's not an equal one. The countries most vulnerable to rising seas, drought, and disaster are often the very countries that were once colonized, places where resources were extracted to build Western wealth. This is coloniality in action. The global North industrialized through colonial extraction, while the global South is now asked to bear the brunt of the crisis, and sometimes even blamed for not adapting fast enough. Postcolonial IR pushes us to ask who gets a seat at the climate table, and who ends up paying the price for centuries of others' emissions. Postcolonial theory also transforms how we see international development. At first glance, aid and loans might seem helpful, but when development is structured through conditions like structural adjustment programs, debt traps, or trade liberalization, postcolonial scholars see a form of neocolonialism. It's not about flags or armies anymore, it's about economic control. Who sets the rules, who gets to define progress, and who benefits. Thinkers like Arturo Escobar argue that development often reproduces the same hierarchies as colonialism, just under new labels. In his groundbreaking work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney didn't just argue that Europe failed to develop Africa, he argued that Europe actively underdeveloped it. His argument was a direct challenge to ideas that poverty in the Global South was an accident of history. As he put it, all of the countries named as underdeveloped in the world are exploited by others, and the underdevelopment with which the world is now preoccupied is a product of capitalist, imperialist, and colonial exploitation. These aren't isolated examples. Whether we're talking about humanitarian intervention, global finance, border regimes, or cultural diplomacy, postcolonial IR gives us a different toolkit for analysis. It helps us ask, who has the power to define the problem? Whose history is shaped by the system we're working in? And whose voices are still waiting to be heard? And this is what makes postcolonial theory not just a critique, but a call to reimagine global politics from the ground up. So far, we've seen how postcolonial IR critiques the dominant narratives of the field, its Eurocentrism, its silences, its blind spots. But postcolonial theory isn't just about calling out problems, it's also about imagining something better. One of the biggest contributions of postcolonial theory is its call to decolonize the study of international relations. This means recognizing that the field has historically excluded non-Western voices, not just from global decision-making, but from theories, frameworks, and textbooks. Postcolonial theorists argue that we need to move beyond the idea that valid knowledge can only come from Europe or North America. There's a rich tradition of political thought from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and indigenous communities, all of which can help us understand world politics in new ways. Postcolonial theory also feeds into the broader movement known as global IR. Global IR calls for a discipline that is more inclusive, more pluralistic, and more genuinely global in how it studies international relations. One of the leading proponents of global IR is Amitav Acharya. He argues that this isn't about destroying old theories, but about enriching them. In his words, our task is not to reject the existing IR theories and methods out of hand, but to broaden their sources and test their claims against a wider range of historical and cultural experiences. In short, global IR doesn't reject theory, it expands it by recognizing multiple ways of knowing, different historical trajectories, and the legitimacy of diverse voices. And finally, postcolonial theory brings a new kind of honesty to our discipline. It reminds us that international relations was never just about sovereign equals, it was also about empires, extraction, and resistance. And it insists that we account for that history in how we teach, research, and engage the world.